So, all right. Here we are. So my name is Anna Skoura. I've studied and worked in conservation, and now I have a PhD in urban heritage, and now I'm working in UCD as a postdoc in a project that tries to map and understand vacancy, particularly in Irish towns. I will be chairing today's webinar. For those of you who are joining the Talking Towns for the first time, let me just say, this is part of the CIFIT, the Centre for Irish Towns. The Centre for Irish Towns aims to build a network of people interested in Irish towns and generate conversations about the challenges facing Irish towns and the role of research policy in addressing them. Talking Towns is just one of our mechanisms to do this. This series is co-organized by me and by Stephen Wall. And we are part of the working group, and all the previous sessions are available in the CIFIT YouTube channel if you're interested in following them. We have one more seminar for this spring series, and that's on the 9th of May on the Town Centre First policy. And there will be another series in the fall that we will announce shortly. Let me just say our focus today is urban heritage. The title is Urban Heritage, People and Places. And while the theme I know is a very broad one, what we like to highlight is the plural, dynamic, and contested nature of heritage, as well as the connections between heritage places and heritage practices. Our speakers today, they come from different disciplines, and they have very different perspectives, but all three share an interest in urban heritage of towns, and unpacking the question, why are certain places considered heritage places, and what is it that makes them important, and to who? So we will please keep your comments for the end for all three. You can type them in the chat, and if you were able to say who the question is addressed is for, that would help us very much. And we'll start with Merlo Kelly. She's a Grade 1 conservation architect and a design fellow, also a PhD researcher at University College Dublin. She's an elected member of the Irish Architectural Archive and ICOMOS. She was awarded the ICOMOS Rachel McRory Award for her Master's in Urban and Building Conservation thesis on Luke Gardner and the development of Dublin. Research forms an integral part of her teaching and practice, and Merlo has disseminated her research in several publications and public lectures. Her PhD research examines how architectural conservation values and skills can inform collaborative pedagogies in response to the climate and biodiversity emergencies. Her presentation is titled Historic Urban Landscapes, Interpreting Heritage. Merlo, can I ask you to unmute and share your screen?
Okay. I hope you can all hear me okay.
I can't hear you. I don't know if...
Can you hear me? Oh, you can. Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, Anna and Stephen, for the invitation to talk about urban heritage, and to all the Centre for Irish Towns team. I'm delighted to be part of this conversation. So I'm as Anna mentioned, I'm involved in research for a PhD, and it's drawing together my practice, my architecture and conservation practice, but also teaching and then past research and writing. But I suppose I'm attempting to bring a lot together. But today I actually I'm not getting into too much theory of what I'm looking at, but I'm rather kind of drawing from practice from the past, and just touching on a few case studies. And I suppose the challenge of squeezing it into 10 to 15 minutes. So it's really just a quick snapshot of some of my thoughts around urban heritage. And just to say, over the past couple of years, we've had many conversations about how we teach architecture and how we practice in the context of the climate and biodiversity crises. And just to quote Felicity Atekpe, we need to move from a mentality of abundance to a mentality of scarcity in every aspect of our thinking. And in a way, that's kind of a lot of what's driving what I'm doing and how I'm thinking. And just as part of this thinking, I would argue that we need to celebrate and protect our urban heritage. And I think that's just a given at this stage, really. But just a few definitions before I dive into just a few examples of interpretations of urban heritage. The well-worn precept that the greenest building is the one that already exists. This would underpin my research and my writing. Really just, I suppose, the understanding that we have to work with what we have. And that's a quote from Carl Elefante, but it's something that I suppose we've all been discussing. And part of this, I suppose, is in response to this kind of current worrying trend of demolition and rebuilding, which is rife at the moment. And it's not just an Irish problem. I think this is something that's happening globally, and I'm hopeful that there's a slight turning of the tide. But it's just, yeah, it's something that I've been noticing a lot over the past, even the last 18 months, places disappearing. And so a lot of what I'm talking about is the kind of maybe the hidden meaning and interpretations behind the built heritage, because traditionally working in conservation architecture, the focus was on the built, and now increasingly it's shifting to this wider interpretation that I'm going to talk about. Another important definition is one from Fielden, and it's the idea of conservation as management of change, as a way of managing change dynamically. And it's rather that than preservation. And it's quite removed from that idea of keeping things static, and that it's about allowing and adapting to change in urban centres and obviously in buildings. So I have to mention the UNESCO HUL, or Historic Urban Landscapes approach. I'll refer to it as the HUL approach, which really just brings in this kind of interpretation of the urban environment as this layered system. And it's kind of towns, cities, villages that, you know, have these many, many layers. So social, environmental, cultural, economic, but also just, I suppose, rather than looking at buildings as or sites as isolated entities, that it's a much more connected system. And I think that's a fundamental starting point. Just again, wider definitions of heritage, and these were just definitions that I prepared for workshops I was doing with students. And it's the idea of encompassing tangible and intangible, so that the physical, but also the intangible values that are associated with place. And we'll go through a few of those just as I'm looking at them. And oops. Obviously, there's wider definitions, and there's all sorts of layered definitions, but cultural heritage encompassing all of this, and the very important natural heritage, and all of these are inextricably linked in our urban centres. So, and these were just examples when I was working with students, and we were looking at Birr, and it was kind of getting them to think maybe beyond the obvious sites and buildings that are celebrated, and looking kind of at the hidden layers underneath. And just, I suppose, a nice example of this kind of overlap between the kind of tangible and intangible. And this was a study I was doing with Lots Architecture. We were looking at the sites associated with the cable station in Valencia. And on the west of the island, there's this derelict building, which is a lot more derelict than it was here. And this is an image from 1977. And what was lovely was, you know, in this image, these kind of patterns in the field emerged, and you could see the marks of the cable coil and the cable lines. And this very, very modest kind of derelict building was part of a huge story, which was the first transatlantic communications in the 1850s and 60s. So first communications really between Europe and America. So it's really just, I suppose, the kind of the meanings beneath that aren't always immediately obvious. So then, just to reinforce that, obviously examining everything with this lens of environmental, social, cultural, economic, and the wider meanings that are involved with the place. And in many ways, it's about reassessing the value of a place beyond economic value. And that's something I come across a lot, where things are interpreted in their economic value, and that's the argument for getting rid of them. And this means that very ordinary buildings and sites might have great significance for community and for towns in which they are. And then, you've the case of this is just an example from New York, this Globe Slicers shop, which, it is in many ways, it's like I suppose it represents an enduring presence, but also a glimpse into kind of former character of a historic street or businesses of a historic street. And these sites are precious in our increasingly homogenized world. And then this consideration of inherent value can work in other ways. The occupation of a disused railway track in Paris, introducing new value to an abandoned site. So it can work both ways. So I'm just going to quickly go through some examples of places where we kind of explored wider meanings of urban heritage. And the first is the presentation, or the former presentation convent in Portlaoise, which is an extraordinary site with a very, very complex layers of cultural heritage. It's an ancient site located along the Treogue River in the centre of Portlaoise. And in addition to the survey of the physical, we began mapping and gathering sources in an attempt to understand the history and the evolution of the site. And you can see there an image from the 40s of these nuns in the field. Obviously the historic maps present a lot of information and archive photos. But we came across this wonderful map of Portlaoise, or Maryborough as it was known, which dates from around 1560, and it emerged in the National Archives in England, in Kew. And in this we can see the 16th century fort protector, which is very much intact. But opposite, there's also this building with a stone tower attached. And this tower, which dates from about 1548, is actually forms the southeast corner of the present convent. And it's clearly depicted here alongside a mill building and the river represented, and that's just a close-up. So this was a lovely find, and we were trying to trace the attached buildings. Now, the convent itself dates from the 1830s, but was built on an older site. But if you jump forward to 1977, and you can see this is the second floor plan, and the tower has been occupied by bathrooms for the convent community. And this in itself tells a story, and it's kind of I suppose there's this importance of the various phases in history and how you can't really negate any of them, that they're all kind of part of the story of the site. The convent itself is in a very derelict state, and again, if you kind of use this, I suppose, to view it as a kind of a shell or a kind of a built form, without looking at these stories beyond, it really, there's an argument for it to be got rid of. And I suppose that's something we fight against or argue against many times in practice. And this is, I suppose, misrepresenting the value of the place. And then internally, obviously, there are all these traces of these past lives and these kind of parts of the narrative, really, that need to be recorded and celebrated. And I think that's part of it. And often very concealed. I mean, this is just a hidden window linking the infirmary to the chapel. And that was so that sick members of the community could attend Mass. And in addition to that, there's a very rich archaeological history on this site. And a couple of tunnels unearthed, and one in particular connecting the stone tower to the fort protector, uncovered in various stages of building work. I'm going to jump to Newport Town, which is another study with lots, and this was one we were commissioned to do a character study, which was an interesting thing, by the heritage officer in Mayo County Council. And again, initial studies, you're kind of documenting the very obvious important buildings and the built heritage generally in the town, significant sites and buildings, and going through the historic maps to record this. And then gradually building up a picture, going through other kind of recorded sites and trying to kind of get the layers of the town and the settlements through the centuries. But then as you delve into, I suppose, this is also recording the place and the context and the materials and trying to understand what fragments are left and what are new and all the additions to complete a kind of a fuller picture. And delving into the archives then and talking to locals, and then the layers of significance become a lot more complex and a lot more interesting in many ways. And just some quick examples, these are obviously archival images of Newport, but this lovely image from 1880 where we see the north riverbank along Castlebar Street is used as a productive landscape. And the question obviously then, you know, you kind of look at today and you think, could that be reinstated? Could this serve the community in some way? And it's kind of just looking at all these parts and maybe trying to understand the origins of the street patterns and the forms that are there. We also had some amazing, this is actually courtesy of Orla Murphy, but this is some beautiful images of the town, and this is the main street, and is often the site of fairs and markets, sheep markets. And what's lovely is you get this insight into the community and the people. But also this is a photograph from the Lawrence collection. And I think what's extraordinary is the information and the knowledge that you can get around materials and the kind of, I suppose, lost buildings and businesses, and this in this case a hotel, but most importantly also of the people and how they lived. And that brings a kind of a richness to your investigations. And of course, the important railway tunnel from this image is from around 1900. It remains closed at the moment. I know there was talk of diverting the Greenway through it, but I understand that that isn't happening. But so all of these kind of parts of the story of the town that actually contribute to its significance. And finally, I'm just going to have a quick look at Feenish Island in Connemara, which was a study I did back in 2008 for the Heritage Council, but it kind of comes back to me in different guises. And again, I suppose it's a very modest settlement, just about urban and uninhabited since 1982, but has an extraordinarily rich cultural heritage. So carried out some mapping studies, and you can see here the striped land. So the Congested Districts Board took over the land in 1898 and striping it to form these long, narrow plots as illustrated. But as I dug deeper, I came across lots of writings and poems about the island, many written by former islanders. And this one by John Redmond particularly struck a chord and captured the kind of melancholy abandonment of the place. I suppose the ghosts of the past islanders and their traditions. And again, I was kind of measuring the buildings and trying to understand how they were built and where they were built and the various settlements. But what emerged then as I interviewed past inhabitants and local people was something much more significant. And it was this evidence of a rich culture and tradition of music and storytelling on what was described by many as a party island and a place of great natural beauty and biodiversity. So what began effectively as a survey of the island turned into something else along the way. So the landscape of Feenish and the stories became inextricably linked. So it was impossible to study the landscape without an understanding of its layered heritage. And just a quick definition, I suppose, that came to mind in all of these studies is the concept of genius loci, or spirit of place. And it's the Latin term meaning the genius of the place. So referring to the presiding deity or spirit, each place has its own unique qualities, not only in terms of its physical makeup, but of how it is perceived. And I suppose that how it is perceived and that perception of place is something that I think comes across to be a very important element when we're looking at these places. And the historic landscapes approach And these broader interpretations of heritage are about bringing people and their traditions and cultures to the centre of focus. So reinforcing this concept of historic urban environments as connected systems, natural and cultural heritage. And just what's of great importance in each of the studies is the engagement with the community where possible. And it's through these conversations that all the forms of cultural and natural heritage and the knowledge and traditions that allow them to be protected and celebrated endure and thrive. So, I mean, there's a lot more to say, but I just, with that genius loci or spirit of place in mind, just to argue that the most ordinary buildings, sites and landscapes can hold great significance for the local community. And this is an image of Birr from, again, around 1895. And I'll leave you with some Birr locals from that time. And thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Merlo. We're gonna go to our second speaker. Please pop your questions in the chat if you want to for Merlo. So our second speaker is Dr. Neza Cebron Lipovec. She's an art historian specialized in the field of conservation and architectural history. She carried out her studies in Belgium and Slovenia and is currently an assistant professor and researcher at the Department and Institute for Archaeology and Heritage at the Faculty of Humanities of the University of Primorska, Slovenia. Key fields of research encompass post-Second World War architectural history and conservation, contemporary issues in immovable heritage conservation and management. Over the last decade, she has focused on critical heritage studies, particularly on anthropological perspectives in built heritage conservation, heritage discourses, and participatory methods in conservation. She's a vice chair of the UNESCO Chair on Interpretation and Education for Enhancing Integrated Heritage Approaches at the Faculty of Humanities of the University of Primorska. She teaches different courses on heritage and architectural history, and she collaborated in several national, international, and cross-border research projects, currently focusing on heritage for an inclusive transformation, as well as slow memory and the dynamics of placemaking. Her presentation is titled Group Memory Talk and Walk for an Inclusive Significance Assessment of the Historic Environment.
Thank you very much, Anna, for this broad introduction. So I will just share my screen, and I'd just like to say I'm really glad to be participating in this Irish topics that is not only Irish, it's actually, I think you will see, it's actually quite international, the challenges you're addressing. Just one second. Okay. I want to apologize in advance because I will be reading in order to try to stick to the time. So today I would like to share with you part of my current, though actually long-term running research on the role and potential of ethnographic methods for built heritage conservation, particularly in contested sites. It is an endeavor that I started developing, and it is in this endeavor, that I started developing a new method, or perhaps a new combination of existing methods that I call group memory talk. The research was triggered more than 10 years ago when I was still researching the post-World War II architecture in my home region called Istria, set at the top of the Adriatic Sea on the border between Slovenia and Italy. Back then, several demolitions of valuable modernist buildings took place. This fact raised my professional interest about the reasons behind the demolitions, and particularly about the potential heritage value and significance assessment of these buildings in the eyes of the local inhabitants. This is of particular importance because the region of Istria is marked, on the one hand, by historical multiculturality, as it lays on the crossroad between Romance and Slavic cultures, but especially, on the other hand, because it was subject to a major demographic change after World War II, when about 90% of the pre-war, mainly Italian-speaking population left or had to leave, and newcomers from inner Slovenia and other Yugoslav inhabitants settled in. The current inhabitants of the city centers have today barely 80 years of common history, but I underscore city centers, not the hinterland. The hinterland has been mainly Slavic speaking and quite multicultural. But so the city centers have barely 80 years of common history, And modernist architecture is actually the architecture that marked the new era when this joint history started. So obviously dissonances, even contested views about heritage values are more than present, more or less visibly. It was to address this question that with some colleagues from the local museum, we organized for a first very intuitive and ad hoc research initiative in the city of Koper more than 10 years ago, between 2012 2014, and we titled it, I'm Telling the Story of the Town. It encompassed seven public events of collective remembering and storytelling, and it aimed at researching exactly the place attachment of the local population and their valuing of historic space. The events showed that several, actually pointed out to many potentials that such impromptu, so not planned community events, so people came randomly without knowing who would actually join, and the impact was strong. The potential lied in the talking to each other about themselves as a community. And it was actually this way that we responded also to the central definition of heritage as a cultural process, or to quote the European Fire Convention, the cultural heritage as a group of resources, yes, inherited from the past, which people identify independently of ownership, but it is primarily a reflection and expression of the constantly evolving values, beliefs, knowledge, and traditions. So this, I underscore here really this evolving position, so the relativeness of heritage values, and especially the fact that heritage is about reflecting our own values. So it was only later that I realized that the core element of these sharing events that we organized was actually what Catherine Degnan calls memory talk, or to quote, it is the discourse in which social memories become lodged in places, both present and erased, and people, both alive and deceased, outside intentionally commemorative and ritual contexts, end quote. But let's add another quote, maybe more explicit. It is about the social memory woven into the fabric of daily life, of daily talk and gossip in all its variety, contradiction, and everydayness. In this way, revealing a profoundly meaningful way of relating to the surrounding world, both physical and social. So memory talk can be a chat between two people, but what then if we make more people debate? As a result, within this current, it's a postdoc research that I'm carrying out, I tried to develop this past experience into a more structured way, as said, this method that I call for the moment group memory talk. It also aims to tackle some of the current and permanent issues raised by the scholarship, such as you see in point 1, the dichotomy between theory and practice that still marks the built heritage conservation, and the attempts to promote participation and develop people-centered approaches. The second theoretical point comes from critical heritage studies and theory, which focuses currently on emotion and affect, and in terms of conservation practice, this again links to place attachment. Third point, within the critical heritage studies, it was highlighted that there is a lack of interest in material heritage as it focuses on the intangible dimensions of heritage. In this way, we bring back an equal focus on the tangible and intangible. And finally, the fourth theoretical point comes from the theory and interpretation of heritage, where Professor Azul underscores that meaning-making processes occur exactly through talking to each other. And so the group memory talk is or aims to become a collaborative research method combining elements and characteristics of focus groups, impromptu group interviews, photo voice and photo eliciting, as well as, of course, individual interviews, archival research, participant action research, and of course, memory talk. Much of the methodological inspiration I derived from the work of the anthropologist Professor Seta Lowe and her rapid ethnographic assessment procedure and its shorter version tests that she has been developing over the last 3 decades. So the objectives of the methods are quite obvious, I believe, but still let's list them. It is about collectively investigating the shared and dissonant meanings and place attachment to the built environment within a potential heritagization process by making members of different groups of the community talk to each other. The second aim is to thus stimulate collaborative research in order to take heritage as, and here I quote Višnja Kisic, an expert in heritage studies, she says that heritage can be or is a platform for dialogue and mutual recognition, particularly in view of its contested history. Third point, of course, is to empower the involved community in the heritage conservation process and thus follow a currently underscored deauthorizing perspective. Last but not least, fourth aim is to collect data from informal and traditional knowledge concerning material aspects of the built unit, of the built environment, for the needs of the conservation interventions. It is, of course, a work in progress definition, and so far I applied it in 3 case studies in 2 cities on the border between Slovenia and Italy. The method, I structured it in 5 phases. The first phase, of course, is about identifying the sites, which takes place through mappings. This can be done either in physical, so in analog way, or through social media. If this has already been done, of course, this phase can be skipped. Then second phase is crucial, is the preparatory individuals, preparatory individual interviews with identified interlocutors, along with archival research and, if needed, this rapid ethnographic assessment procedure. Phase 3 is optional, so to say, but I do use it, and it's participatory action research. So far, I engaged in participatory exhibition. And only in phase 4 comes the memory talk event. And then there's the obligatory phase 5, which refers to reciprocal ethnography, and which requires us ethically, of course, and we as researchers want to do it, to return to the interlocutors in different ways, to booklets, documentaries, events. And so finally, the case study. I would like to present one of my case studies, and it is about an open public space called Giardinetto, located in the city center of the historic core of Koper Capodistria, which is the northernmost historic Venetian town on the Istrian coast. So this open space was historically an orchard of the municipality palace. Then it was transformed into a historicist park. In post-World War II, it was transformed into a playground. In the 70s, then in a parking, and in 2022, the parking was removed. So it's currently awaiting renovation. But key element that takes us to dissonant meanings is that it has no official name. Although it's huge compared to its historic environment, it's considered just part of the nearby street. In this case, concerning the phases, we went through all the phases. Particularly eloquent were actually 2 participatory exhibitions. And let me now introduce how this memory talk is conceived. It's an event, so we are now in this 4th phase. It's an event where participants are random visitors, so no one is actually invited specifically, and the visitors, so the participants, are the central actors of the event. The setting is semicircular in order to promote the talking to each other material. It is backed with photographic material collected through the participatory exhibition that works as a starting point for triggering the talk, the memories. Interlocutors from the preparatory interviews were then often invited to talk first, so to stimulate the debate. But before the whole event starts, there's this step 1, as it is framed in 3 steps. So step 1, before the actual sharing, I ask people to write down in this very old-fashioned manner on pink post-its, so like pink as the pink glasses of nostalgia, to write down their own perceptions of what this site means to them personally, just in order to position them on their very personal, affective perspective. And then the talk starts. Namely, it aims, of course, at going from the past, so recollections about the past, to a critical overview of qualities, past and present, onto visions of the future. During the event, with usually about 40 attendees and more participate. In this case, many facts were identified, also several concerning these very material aspects, such as the hand-drawn ground plan of the historicist park that some of the participants still remembered, and of which we had no archival trace, although only this photo. This same person also sketched the ground plan of the later playground. Along with these material aspects, of course, attitudes were identified too, and not few dissonances were expressed, but more were the shared values that linked to memories of childhood and the less technological past. Halfway through the event, the second step takes place, and it consisted again of writing down answers, this time concerning past and current qualities of the site. Answers were immediately shared, and after a joint discussion, written down into this kind of matrix, which included a 6-level ranking of importance, following the 6-grade ranking used by the Slovene conservation authorities for the conservation project protocols. It spanned from outstanding, high, middle to minor, or no importance or obstructive value. Well, participants were invited to mark their grading for each quality identified. The qualities for this site that were identified, of course, related to the former greenery, the playground, the childhood, the sociability of the space, of the community feeling, but also the peacefulness, the intimacy, and the calm. And then we further exchange of memory sharing occurred to end with the third step that comes as a closing and directs towards envisioning the future. The participants were again asked to respond to the question, what do I wish for Giardinetto in 10 years' time? Wishes, of course, met the qualities identified in terms of the material aspects, but it is worthwhile to stress that all answers explicitly linked also to current issues like extreme weather conditions and climate crisis and the related lack of greenery that they wanted to be reinstalled again, and also digital intoxication and lack of sociability. In these attitudes, so in these attitudes are identified, we may encounter clearly what Laura Jane Smith calls progressive nostalgia. This is the constructive and critical view of the positive experiences of the past oriented towards the future. And I'm reaching the conclusion by sharing what were the responses to the event in this case study. In relation to the dissonance and contested history, it was extremely positive and unexpected, but there was a descendant of the expelled Italian pre-war inhabitants of the square that participated and actually identified several persons on the historic pictures earlier collected through the exhibition. But most of all, the point was that he met and encountered and talked to the current inhabitants. So the link between this actually silenced or concealed past and the present was put into light and praised, thus meaning making occurred. And then the whole research was later synthesized and presented to the local authorities as an expert ethnographic study, which then served as basics for the architects in the design of the renovation. Also, the conservators from the Regional Institute were very fond of the results. Last but not least, a video documentary is coming about the method. And here I conclude with some critical self-reflections. The point is that the events had a high level of participation, but often not all groups of the local inhabitants are present, especially newcoming immigrant communities, also youngsters. Then dissonances are identified, but they refer mainly to age, perhaps language, sometimes symbolic boundaries. In terms of methodology, it is important that it was appreciated by the conservation officials, but the question still remains. How do we translate these kind of results or insights of memory events into an actual design of conservation or renewal intervention, especially considering that heritage is a process and heritage value is ever evolving? And linked to that, how can we make this kind of agonistic interpretation? So meeting differing views, encounter physical conservation. How to address dissonances in this regard? Should that be done through critical toponymy? I will skip the fifth because links to this one and finish with the final, which is of course the positionality of the researcher. What is actually the role, my role, your role, in this context? How can we remain only facilitators or at most co-creators and not become yet again an authority? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Neza. That was very, very interesting. And last but not least, Dr. James Hennessey is going to present next. He's a chartered landscape architect and urban designer based in Belfast and working across Ireland and his native Scotland. He's a director with the award-winning placemaking consultancy, the Hogarth Company, for where he leads a range of strategic projects, mostly on behalf of public sector and community clients. James is also involved in research and teaching, both as an advisor to the Ministerial Advisory Group on Architecture and the Built Environment in Northern Ireland, and as a guest tutor and recent PhD graduate at Queen's University Belfast. His presentation is titled Portlaw, Remodeling Ireland's First Model Village.
Thank you very much, Anna, and great to be here this afternoon. Fantastic speakers thus far, no pressure. I am going to talk to you about a project that we've been doing in a really special place called Portlaw in County Waterford. I'll try and keep to 10 minutes so that we've got a bit of time afterwards for a bit of discussion. But as Anna said, I'm fortunate to be a director at the Hogarth Company. So we try very hard to make a difference by designing places and spaces with people and the environment at their heart. And you might be familiar with some of our work in Ireland. We also work a lot in Scotland as well. And of course, this kind of work is very much about working with people. So it's understanding places, but it's engaging with the people who live there, who go to school there, who have every right to have an opinion and actually have great expertise to bring to understanding about their place. This project derives from the Town Centre First policy. I think that's the subject of the next talk next month. And we were commissioned by Waterford City and County Council. And we worked alongside Hall Black Douglas architects and conservation architects to look at the town of Portlaw. And I won't go through this, but this is from our brief. So it's a sign that both the council, but crucially the local community, have great aspirations and have given a great deal of thought to the future of their town. And it was a pleasure to join them in this journey of developing a shared plan. Very much a collaborative process, and the Town Centre First process involves the creation of a town team. So that's comprised of local community, businesses, interest groups, and we had a lot of fun, a lot of post-it notes in terms of understanding their place and understanding what its future may hold. So Portlaw is in County Waterford, located between Waterford City and Carrick-on-Suir, and you can see the River Suir there connecting the two. It's an interesting location as well. It's unusually for Ireland, it's surrounded by woodland, and it's very close to the Curramore estate, which you might have heard of, famous for its All Together Now festival, of course, as well as its fascinating history itself. Now, in urbanism, you're always using the word unique. Unique gets banded around an awful lot, but my goodness, in terms of an urban layout, this certainly is unique. Really fascinating settlement of Portlaw. And the history of that is down to a Quaker industrialist called David Malcolmson, who came to this area in the 1820s, created one of the first cotton factories in the area. And then he was inspired by industrial settlements happening in Britain. So in 1841, laid out this rather magnificent model village. And you can see there that you've got the cotton factory on the left of your screen. And leading to that is Factory Road and a square and a series of streets that radiate from that square. So a really interesting design, very practical one. It's about getting people efficiently from their homes to their workplaces. But in true Quaker fashion, there was a huge amount of community infrastructure also as part of the village, with a commitment to the health and the welfare and the education of the local community at its time. This is a photograph from 1911, and it really gives you a sense for this very unique layout, these rows of workers as houses. But if you look carefully, you can also see quite a bit of dereliction going on there. And that's because the cotton mill ceased to function in the late 19th century, and the town went through a rapid process of decline until in the 1930s, a tannery, the Irish tanners, set up shop in Portlaw. And it was a second stage of industrial rejuvenation of the town. Really an amazing place. If you're ever in County Waterford, I really encourage you to go. There's such history, but also talking to people and their pride and their memories and the associations they have with this place, even though that they still have the challenges of dereliction and vacancy to contend with. So this is one of those radial streets. You'll notice the very characteristic townhouses. They have a unique roof construction called the Portlaw Truss, which is another aspect of the architectural heritage of the town. I mentioned dereliction. There is certainly a bit in the town. This is Mayfield House, which would have been the Malcolmsons' residence, although recently acquired by a developer with a track record in hotel development. So the seeds of hope are there for the town and its future, rejuvenation. And also some wonderful surrounding landscape, some really old oak woodlands, as well as a Quailshire forestry plantation. So with the community and a whole series of workshops, we talked about the place, its history, what it means to them, but also very much about the present day, about the challenges and the requirements, and about the future. And this phrase there on the left about Ireland's first model village, an inspiration to many, was planned as the best possible place in which to live and work. And the community very much looked back with pride, but forward with confidence. And through this exercise, we are trying to capture some of that ambition for the future and the quality of place that can be created. And this led to a whole series of proposals which are set out here about continuing the story and celebrating that heritage and identity. How do we tell the stories of Portlaw? There's a wonderful little heritage centre with lots of room for development. The development of the house and the factory is certainly something which they want to encourage, but also how do they communicate and tell their stories through interpretation, not just to the visitor, but to residents as well. There's that wonderful landscape on the doorstep of Portlaw. How do we open up access to that through trails, through bringing the river and the canal back to life, but also thinking about biodiversity and those precious ecosystems. And this is the square today. Not quite the kind of Baroque masterpiece that you might imagine from the layout plan. It's effectively a very large roundabout. But if you look carefully, you can see it's still the center of the community, and people regularly meet on the roundabout. Children play on the roundabout, and thankfully there's not an awful lot of traffic. The road space is far grander than the traffic that's there. So one of the proposals to emerge with the community through this is to reclaim a lot of that road space and recreate a space which is very much the heart of the community. So effectively remodeling the model town. There's a great project in waiting now for the next stage. Certainly we'll give some transport planners some fun and games, but also a massive opportunity for the local community. So that's the square and the factory road. The revitalization of the historic buildings is so important. And I think, as both speakers have said, it's not just the landmark buildings, but it's those everyday buildings as well, which need that care and community. We've also been commissioned to look at the development of a community hub, the centre, and we're looking at a series of locations around Portlaw. But this building here is really fascinating. This is the old courthouse and schoolhouse, which has lain derelict for many, many years. But an amazing history, and that's a slightly older photograph of the site. And whilst it would be much more expensive to rejuvenate this as the community hub, we're certainly very keen to explore how that could happen. So once again, this building comes back into the lives of the local community and the people that live there. Other proposals around an area in terms of development of a new neighbourhood. thinking about the streets and how we move around Portlaw, and as I mentioned, the restoration of those everyday buildings. So I guess this project is an illustration of how we really have to plan and be strategic about the care of really special urban environments, but they're not museums. They can't be wrapped up in cotton wool. They have to thrive as places for communities today. And that holds great possibilities for the future. And I love this photograph. We had an event on the square. You can see the roundabout in the background. But here's 3 generations of the town together, reflecting on what were the draft proposals. And I think that really it gives a vivid illustration of the power of place and of memory, but also of hope for the future. And this wonderful little illustration came from a girl called Freya at the National School. Why can't Portlaw be her and our dream village for the future? Some simple interventions like more benches, new benches at the Ducks, as well as some of those grander plans that we've talked about through the Town Centre First plan. So that's a little bit of the work that we've been doing in Portlaw, Model Village. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James, and thank you for being succinct. We have a little bit of time. There are already 2 questions on the chat. The first one is by Orla Murphy to Merlo. Merlo, do you have access to the chat, or would you like me to read it to you?
I do indeed. Yeah. No, great question, Orla. I presume everyone can see the question there. Yeah. So, I mean, I think absolutely what you're saying out. I suppose I hope it came across that the kind of the layers of development are the important thing, and it's not that idea of kind of freezing something in time, and that obviously equally applies to future development and what's happening. And I think, I mean, it's all the more important because our urban centres are transforming quite rapidly and with different communities and different meanings then that kind of emerge as well. So it's kind of an interesting thing to allow that change. But I suppose key to that is that thing of consultation. I think all of us have kind of commented on that, and it's something that in practice we probably weren't. I mean, for various reasons, it didn't happen as much as maybe it should have. But that idea of knowing what the community want or what is important to the community is a step that historically probably was often skipped. You know, that you do the research as a visitor and maybe you're not getting into the kind of the in-depth understanding of what makes it a place. So, I mean, I liked your Kevin Barry reference. I mean, it's kind of the living thing is, you know, and I think that comes up in teaching, the living part of things, or the facility to let things evolve and change is critical. So although we celebrate it, we're obviously, and I think obviously James's steps, you know, that thing of, and in fact it came in Neza's as well, that thing of the future and imagining the future, that thing of allowing imagination and freedom to do that is so important. Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if that answers it, but I know traditionally, I suppose the idea of conservation and there's often this kind of perception that it is about rules and protecting, and in a way I'm trying to kind of break that down and challenge that. So yeah.
Thank you. And Miriam has a question for Neza. I don't know if you can see it, Neza, or if you want me to read it for you.
No, I can see. Thank you very much, Anna. And thanks, everyone. I really enjoyed these presentations. And I think, well, I already see, as we said before, connecting points. Thank you very much, Miriam, for your question, for the issue you raised about Professor Seta Low's methods. Actually, these are methods she's been developing for quite a while in a shorter and longer versions. And yes, I do have some hints about how it can be applied on small scale, lower occupancy towns, because that's more or less exactly my case. Plus, we had the pleasure to have Professor Low coming over, and we had a workshop with her in September 2022. And I must say, well, just for the others, this is not to make it a lecture, but basically Setelo developed this REAP, so this rapid ethnographic assessment procedure that is composed of doing at the same, so it's normally done in 2 weeks, but she has done a shorter version that can be done in, say, 4 days by a group of researchers, and it's composed of behavioral mapping, physical traces mapping, group interviews, planned and impromptu individual interviews, even focus groups, but well, that's a matter of time. We did that exactly for Giardinetto, and it was very, very eloquent. I mean, it was really useful. So I would definitely recommend it. And I don't think scale is an issue in the sense, if it's a problem for small towns. I think even it's more suitable for smaller towns or city neighborhoods in bigger cities than, of course, for bigger cities. She herself applied it to some selected cases in Philadelphia on the square, while actually the Independence Square, and then in New York, but I forgot the site. So yeah.
Thank you. So yeah, we did answer both her questions. If anyone else has anything else to ask, there is a little bit more time. If that's not the case, I just wanted to say that it was very interesting to see that while each of you sort of focused on a different part of the process of how do we assess a site that we considered it's important, and how do we ask people what do they think. There is always the issue of how do you then translate this to an actual design, and an open-ended one that would allow for, you know, for whatever the future brings. And James, I thought it was very interesting that you kind of mapped out the different short-term and longer-term interventions and what that would look like. I think it's a very complicated question. I don't necessarily expect an answer to this, but it is very, it makes you think, how can you really translate this into action? Because I always am more focused on the research part and not necessarily the translating. So Merlo or James, I know that you are involved in both ends. So how do you see that? How do you really translate? Is there a...
Yeah, it's a hard one. And also, I think there's a misperception out there amongst many people that conservation is a bad thing. It kind of stops progress and it prevents things happening, and it's red tape. But then at the same time, you can have an amazing conversation with the same people about their pride in their place and their memories and the attachment to their heritage. And I think one of the answers, not the only answer by any means, is good design. I think really good architects, conservation architects, landscape architects can work with heritage and work with local communities to bring heritage back to life in a way that conserves and preserves those elements, but also gives new life into, for example, the old courthouse there that you saw on my screen. So I think we need to let that kind of work flourish and let people to see how we can do both. We can protect these wonderful places, but also we can start writing those new chapters which are so important to the people that live there.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if I could just add, I mean, I think it's a really good synopsis of, but I also would argue, I suppose the thing that I'm realizing more and more is that the very basic kind of process of understanding and all the stuff that you were saying, that obviously the kind of the initial phases of trying to understand a site, but that whole thing of survey and observation sets up for good design, you know, and the more clarity you have around the significance of a place, good design will follow, because it's informed by what you're learning about the place. And I mean, we always say that the site or the building is the primary document, and you learn from that, but you learn from the people as well. And so I kind of think good design has to be I agree that that's absolutely what needs to kind of follow, but it has to be informed by what's there. And I suppose that's sometimes the missing step in sites, you know, where there's it's like James says, that idea of conservation, or maybe even that process, is maybe undervalued. You know, that thing of taking the time to understand. But I mean, there's so much positive there's so many positive examples of that, where historic sites have been developed in a very kind of responsive and sensitive way that enhance rather than detract, you know. So it's that kind of viewing of development as a positive thing, I think, you know, and heritage as a way of kind of promoting good design, really, if that makes sense.
Well, it makes sense to me, definitely. Thank you all. Thank you very much to all three speakers and everybody who participated. I hope we will see you on the 9th of May for our next talk on Certain Town first. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.